What we transition to now is our mother of all buckets in this course, which is the nervous system. Switching over to the nervous system, and nervous system is a prelude for endocrine stuff, and big surprise when we get to the second half of the course, your brain is going to be front and center in all sorts of domains. There was this famous evolutionary biologist in the last century, Theodore Dvjansky, who famously said, like, you can't understand anything in the biological world outside of the context of evolution. And he's always quoted with that, and you see people with t-shirts saying that. And what our theme here is going to be is you can't understand anything about behavior outside the context of the nervous system. And given what this class is about, what we're mostly going to be interested in is how emotions are handled in the brain, and what they have to do with behavior and how it evolved that way, and what's the molecular biology of the neuroscience of emotions and putting those pieces together. Okay, so this whole issue of emotion in the brain gave rise to one of the two true tragic battles of the last century or so, which was two different traditions of neuroscientists who were studying the brain, and nobody knew anything about the brain in the last century, well, in the, I don't know, in the 1930s or so. And there was one group of people who were studying this part of the brain, and what they were noting was this seems to have something to do with olfaction, and they would look at like a rodent brain viewed from above. This is an actual photograph, and this is the olfactory bulb, gigantic olfactory stuff, and they would see this part of the brain would send massive projections into this part of the brain that we're going to learn about soon. Huge number of projections from the olfactory system, much faster than from the visual system or auditory, all of that. And that gave rise to the view, what does this part of the brain do? This is the smell brain. This is the rhinencephalon, as it came to be called. And what does this part of the brain do? It processes olfaction. That's what it's for. Meanwhile, out in the boondocks, there were other researchers, other neuroscience types who were studying the same part of the brain. And what they were noting was, that area seems to have a lot to do with emotion. This part seems to have to do with aggression, this one with sexual arousal, and this part, and they came to call this the emotional part of the brain. Actually, they didn't call it that. For complex reasons, it wound up being called the limbic system. So this set up this huge difference of opinion. Is this whole big chunk of the brain about processing olfaction, or is it about emotion? Is it the rhinencephalon, or is the limbic system and battles back and forth, and brothers at arms killing other brothers and slaughter of peasants throughout villages and Slavic lands and things like that, until people finally figured out something, which is you look at the rat brain, and like 40% of the brain is olfactory bulbs and massive projections underneath. And you look at the human brain, and here's the olfactory bulbs. They're incredibly tiny. Like 3% of the mass of the human brain is devoted to primary processing of olfaction. It's decayed in us. We're not an olfactory species. We're much more visual, all of that. And then you realize, rhinencephalon. Why did we conclude this? That it's the rhinencephalon, this whole part of the brain is the nose brain. Well, they're saying it's about emotion, because if you're a rodent, olfaction and emotion are totally intertwined. Everything you are deciding about your emotional views of the world is coming from olfactory information. If you are a rat, olfactory information and emotions are one and the same. Oh, ethological principles. And what that then predicts is you look at this emotional part of the brain in electric fish, except we're going to see that fish don't have much of it. But if you had electric rodents and they communicated electrically, the electrical receptor inputs would be dominating this limbic emotional part of it. Whatever sensory modality is the most important to you. And we happen not to be a particularly olfactory species. Oh, ethological principles, interview an animal in its own language, and remember its sensory world is different from yours. And great peace ensued just in time for World War II with the recognition that, oh, in rodents, if you're studying the emotional part of the brain, it is overwhelmingly sensitive to olfactory stuff, rhinencephaly. Okay, so this brought about peace in our time, lasting a brief time, and what you then had was, okay, this part of the brain that seems to be very interested in emotion and whatever sensory information is most relevant to emotion in that species. And thus, people began to look at the brain and try to understand where emotion fits into the whole thing. And this gave rise to a pioneering formulation by this guy, Paul MacLean, National Institutes of Health, one of the towering figures of 20th century neuroscience. And he was one of the first ones to get evidence that this part of the brain had something to do with emotion. And MacLean famously came up with the triune brain concept. The triune brain concept, which was you could think of the brain as coming in three layers. Nobody, when he proposed this in 1960, thought this was literal. This was just nobody ever since. And like you find a ridiculous number of current papers saying, ooh, the triune brain is outdated because he was not suggesting that this was literally the case. And we will see the ways in which this is an absurd simplification. But in MacLean's triune brain model, the brain can be thought of as coming in three layers. And just to show you how much this is metaphorical, these are even dotted lines, and that's a human brain seen from the side, which is very distorted. Three layers. First layer down here, the ancient part of the brain, the evolutionarily oldest part of the brain, which he came to call the reptilian brain, and that's given rise to all sorts of endless memes and cartoons. Ancient part of the brain stem, the hindbrain, the hypothalamus. This is the reptilian brain, in that you go and look at this part of the brain in a lizard, and you look at it in us, and it's like basically the same thing. It's the wiring. And what does layer one, what does this reptilian brain do? All the boring stuff, like it keeps track of if your blood glucose levels want to make you hungry, and it keeps track of how high your blood pressure should be, and if you're like cold, sending messages out to this reptile to go shiver or go move to a warmer spot. Just automatic regulatory stuff, just plumbing stuff, just thermostats and various readouts there of just controlling simple loops here. Ooh, message of low body temperature, send out a signal to do something with your blood flow to preserve blood flow to your trunk. Think totally boring. So, reptilian brain, layer one, everybody's got it out there in the animal kingdom. Layer two, mammalian specialty. You see bits and pieces of this part of the brain in non-mammalians, but this is a mammalian specialty. What is layer two about? This is the limbic system. This is the emotional brain we were just talking about. Lizards are not renowned for their emotional lives. It's not until you get to mammals that you see a whole lot of emotional behavior. It's not until you get to mammals that you see a very elaborated limbic system making up a large percentage of the brain with all sorts of structures that you are going to know oh so well by the time we're done with this week. So, the limbic system, layer two, about emotion. Reptilian, boring, plumbing. Everybody in the animal kingdom has basically the same mammalian specialty of emotion. And then up on top is the magnificent, gleaming sort of, what's it called? Olympian level that the brain evolution has brought us to, the primate cortex. All sorts of other species have cortices, and even like birds and fish and mammals have plenty, but it's not until us that you get such a predominance of cortex in the brain. Cortex, thought, long-term planning, cognition, languages, all of that. It's magnificent. We primates have a larger percentage of our brain devoted to cortex than any. So, We've got these three simple, idiotically simple, bearing no relevance to reality whatsoever. There's no dotted lines in the brain, triune brain concept, just a way to formalize thinking. The most ancient parts of the brain having to do with regulatory stuff, the mammalian specialty of emotion, the primate specialty of cortical function. And yeah, this is not literal because lizards have some cortex. Yeah, this is just a way to think about it, and metaphorically, how to think about these functions. So, as soon as people got into this triune brain business, what you then begin to wonder about, what is most interesting then, is what sort of communication goes on between different layers of this triune brain. What sort of stuff is going on? And what people immediately jumped to was a perfectly obvious thing. If you were human instead of a lizard, and you were all impressed with your humanness, which is the most important part of the brain is the cortex. And at least that emotion stuff is more important than that reptile part of the brain, and a picture of top-down regulation, where limbic system could influence function of the reptilian brain, where the cortex could influence function of the limbic system, where the cortex could influence function of the reptilian brain. Top-down regulation, because this is the magnificent epigee of evolution, and of course it's in charge of everything. Top-down regulation. So what would top-down regulation look like? In this case, layer 2 of the limbic system talking to the reptilian brain, it's simple. Like, think about something. Okay, no, you don't think about something. You're a wildebeest, and some like big, scary, aggressive wildebeest shows up on the other side of the field and starts peeing all over your territory, and you get all upset and emotionally aroused, being processed in the limbic system. And among other things, what happens is your heart rate increases, your blood pressure goes up. If all you had was a reptile's brain, there would be no such thing as an emotion, being angry, being aggressive, being afraid, being what. That would change anything going on down here because it's autonomous. It just runs on its own. But here we see emotion can change blood flow in your big toe, all of that. So top-down regulation by the limbic system of the reptilian brain. Top-down regulation of the cortex by the cortex of the limbic system. And all you have to do is go read a book that has some like heartbreaking death scene or whatever, and you're feeling all upset about it. And what you've just proven is this weird abstract thing that humans have come up with called language and writing and meaning and semantics and all of that. And you read a story about novel about fictional characters, they don't even exist. But if you were caught up enough in this cognitive process of deciphering these splotches of ink on a piece of paper, and it's emotionally, the limbic system changes its function. And finally, third level, which is the cortex being able to directly regulate stuff going on down in your reptilian brain. And in this case, like, just sit and think about the fact that your heart is going to stop beating someday, and really visualize how that's going to happen, and there are blood flow stopping and beginning to have your toes turn blue and all of that. And if you're thinking enough about this, not only will you be having emotional responses, but you will be having direct activation of things like blood pressure and heart rate. Okay, so that's how the triune brain works, our magnificent primate ape human cortex running the show and everything else just downstream. And as you probably could have guessed where the plot is going to go here, is there's bottom-up regulation as well. And that's some of the most interesting stuff going on in the nervous system. Bottom up, first generations of people thinking about this stuff would have said, oh my God, of course it's top down, the cortex is magnificent. But you see bottom up regulation, and on a neuroanatomical level, how many neurons up here are sending a projection down to here? How many? When you look at the bottom up regulation, there's as many projections. The brain is as much about this bottom up regulation as the top down. So, what do I mean by what bottom up? What would be an example of this? Okay, going from the reptilian brain to affecting the limbic system. And these are cool studies where you get somebody's reptilian sympathetic nervous system going to something that increases somebody's heart rate. You give them adrenaline, but you don't tell them that you did that. You can't do that anymore. But you give them adrenaline, or you make them do something scary, or you make them like lift a weight a bunch of times, or cross a scary bridge, or all of these have been done.
A high suspension bridge on a windy day is just the place to put Art Aaron's theory to the test that danger can provoke passion.
We had an attractive young woman stand on this scary bridge, and every time a young man would walk across by himself, she would stop him and say, "Excuse me."
I'm doing an experiment for my psychology class on the effects of exposure to scenic attractions on creative expression. Would you mind filling out this questionnaire for me, please? There's a pen.
Almost all the men agreed to do it. After all, it was an attractive woman asking a man to do something. They didn't want to admit they were scared.
And then I have a picture for you to look at. And I'd like for you to write a brief dramatic story based on this photograph.
So the man would write the story, and when he was done, she'd say,
Thank you. I appreciate your time. And I would love, I don't have a whole lot of time now, but I'd love to explain the experiment in more detail when I do have more time. So I'm going to give you my number, and you can feel free to call me. It's at my hotel.
"Okay." So she would write her name and phone number on the edge of her little sheet, tear it off, and hand it to her.
Great. Well, my name's Linda, so
Okay.
I hope you call me.
Okay, Linda.
Nice. Thanks.
She stopped 20 men on the scary bridge, and then she stopped another 20 men on another bridge that was a big, heavy, safe bridge, not very scary at all.
I am doing a project for my psychology class on the effects of exposure to scenic.
Of the men who met her on the scary
You
bridge,
spell out the
many more phoned her that night than the ones who met her on the safe bridge.
You.
The other thing we did is we looked at the stories they wrote. Far more romantic and sexual content.
If you have your heart beating faster and you don't know why, and it's been manipulated, and what you do then is people rate faces as being more attractive than they would otherwise. They rate attractive faces as even more attractive. What's going on in your limbic system? It's doing this thing saying, oh, okay, well, this person's kind of good looking, but whoa, my heart is beating fast. They must be amazing. And you have an autonomic state in your reptilian brain. How intensely are you feeling these emotions? And part of what the limbic system is doing is saying, well, so what's going on down there? How fast am I breathing? What's my body temperature? All of that. It's getting feedback from there, and you've got layer 1 influencing the function of layer 2. So that's totally cool. How about layer 1 reptilian brain influencing the cortex? And this seems the most outlandish thing in the world. Your reptilian brain telling you how to do calculus or something like that. But we see this all the time. And here's one of my all-time favorite studies. That's every year. You're going to hear about this one so much. The hungry judges phenomenon. This was a study published in PNAS, highly prestigious journal, Proceedings National Academy of Sciences, some years ago, where judges, parole board judges, were studied in this country, and it was a year-long study. And what was studied was every single parole decision the judges in the parole system in this country made over the course of that year. Every decision as to hear someone, a prisoner who is up for parole, do I let them walk free, or do I send them back to prison? And looking at what turned out to be like more than 1,000 decisions over the course of the year, and seeing what's the predictor of when a judge is going to send somebody back to prison, or when they are going to allow them to walk. And it turned out that the single best predictor of what decision a judge was going to make was how many hours it had been since they had eaten the meal. And what you saw was right after lunch, judges were paroling people at roughly a 60% rate. By 3-4 hours later, it was straight down to next to zero, just this straight curve going down there. Whoa! That's you're making judicial decisions, and the single best predictor, after controlling for like the person's like record in prison and were they troublemaker, what their crime was, all of that, the single best predictor is how long has it been since you've eaten. And as more time goes by and you get hungrier, you are more likely to throw somebody back in jail. This is flabbergasting. One thing right off the bat, this study was then attacked by some cranks who were complaining about the statistics and some follow-up publications about this. And for my money, the original authors completely rebutted these complaints about statistics, and this phenomenon has been replicated since. What's this about? Why are judges more likely to send somebody back to jail if they're hungry? And this turns out to make perfect sense. And this is going to be very relevant for hereafter. Your brain is expensive. You're hungry. Your blood glucose levels are lower than usual. Your brain is 3% of your body weight, and it takes a quarter of the glucose. And your brain is expensive. And a part of the brain you are going to come to love and know oh so well. One part of the brain plays a role in perspective taking, in thinking about the world from somebody else's perspective, in saying don't jump to a hasty judgment, and it's the most expensive part of the brain. And when your blood glucose levels are getting low, people become less compassionate and less generous and less capable of viewing the world from somebody else's perspective and less capable of understanding they got where they are for very different reasons than how I got where I am, all of that. And when blood glucose levels go down, you see a shift in this. People become less empathic, less generous, and less capable of perspective taking of somebody else's view of the world. So that's amazing. There's a mechanistic explanation for this. What's also amazing, of course, is you sit down a whole bunch of judges and you say, hey, so like that's interesting. You hang out with one of them and say, well, remember right after lunch you had that guy there who had done crime X, Y, and Z, and you parole the person, but now it's 4:30, somebody else shows up with the exact same history of crimes X, Y, and Z, and you threw him back in jail. It seems like that should have been the same decision. Why do you give a different one? And the judge is not going to talk about blood glucose levels. They're going to cite John Rawls and freshman philosophy or who knows something. They are going to come up with a post hoc attribution for how this happened. So, hunger state, amount of glucose in your bloodstream as a result of a reptilian brain doing stuff to the pancreas and stuff coming back, that is influencing like whether or not somebody is freed. That's a big predictor of it, and that has since been replicated. If you ever want to go into a bank and apply for a loan, do not go in when the bank officer, whatever, the person deciding is hungry. If you go in right after they've eaten the meal, same effect. You are more likely to get the loan approved. If instead it is far later, likelihood studies showing you give people sort of mock job applicants, and the hungrier they are, the longer it's been since they've eaten, the shorter they read through the person's resume before tossing it. All sorts of stuff, and a whole world of doctors making very different decisions when they had been food deprived for a while than they would have right after a meal. So that going on, isn't that totally amazing? That's like reptilian brain running moral philosophy you're doing with your cortex there. Here's a fascinating exception to that pattern, and one that shows another piece that comes in here, how something else entirely can make this particular circuit work differently. So it's been found now that judges are less compassionate and less forgiving when they're hungry, all of that. There's one exception to that. And if we were live, I would now see if anyone could guess based on my saying, and this was relevant to the last month or so, a little bit more than the last month, in Sharia courts, in Islamic courts during Ramadan, judges become more forgiving, more merciful, more compassionate, despite the fact that they're fasting all day, they're incredibly hungry. Ramadan, you don't eat when the sun is up. Ramadan, you're hungry as hell, and does that make everyone act like the hungry judges? Exactly the opposite, because of the cultural context. Why are you hungry right now? Because this is a month where you reflect on your community values and what's important, and feel compassion from fellow person and charity and all of that. And it reverses. During Ramadan, judges are more forgiving with parole board hearings and things like that. So we've got this regulating this, but culture coming into it also. So totally cool bottom up in that regard. Finally, we've got the realm in which layer 2, the limbic system, can regulate what's going on in the brain and what's going on in the cortex. And what's that about? That's totally straightforward. That's familiar to also all of us in circumstances where you are strongly emotionally aroused about something and you make some horrendous dumbass decision that you're going to regret for the rest of your life, which seems brilliant at the time. Judgment goes out the window when, for example, you are highly stressed. Impulse control goes out, the executive function, all sorts of things that your cortex is supposed to be fantastic at. And in fact, what the cortex is often doing is sending projections down to the limbic system saying, wait a second, I know you're thinking of doing this impulsive, dramatic thing. Don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. You're going to regret it. Well, your emotions under the control of the cortex. And what you see is just as many projections and just as much control going in the opposite direction, that emotions make us make terrible judgments at times. Or sometimes emotions make us make far more compassionate decisions than we would have otherwise. So we've got this picture of the triune brain, totally artificial, 3 layers, metaphorical, all of that, and the classic picture that, of course, your magnificent cortex is running everything down below, and just down bottom up is at least as important, has at least as many projections, and is often way more interesting. Okay, so with that broad introduction under our belts, what we're now going to set up to do is to turn layer 2 into what are actually the different parts of the limbic system and which talk to which and what they do. And this is getting us ready for all of this. Before jumping into it, we need to look at some like basic principles going on with neuroanatomy, because that's going to be very applicable here. Okay, so first off, what you see is like, here's one neuron sending a projection to another one. Yeah, information comes in, action potential down the axon terminals onto the dendrites. Yep, you got that by now. And what you see is within the brain, you have areas where rather than a random distribution of neurons all over the place, you have clusters of neurons sending projections, clusters of axons to some other cluster of neuronal cell bodies. And this begins to set you up for the fact that the brain comes in different subparts. You look at the evolution of nervous systems, and you went from simple organisms that had like neurons evenly distributed all over the body to beginning to centralize it and centralize function and invent brain. And you see advantages of that. Why do you see that? Why do you see it then taken one step further, which is not only are most of your body's neurons in this one place you call the brain, you see subsets of neurons with related functions in the same place. You see localization function. Why does this happen? Why is this a cool move evolutionarily? Because it's efficient. It's cost saving. These neurons are spending a ton of time communicating with each other, and if they were scattered all over the place in the brain, you would have to spend a fortune building the cables between them. The metabolic costs of making axons. Axons are just fine if you want to talk to a clump of neurons that do something different than what you and your buddies do, but it is far more efficient energetically if all of you who are concerned with whatever this function is were right next to each other, because you all talk to you save money in building the connections between them. The next thing you do related to that is this increases packing efficiency so that you can squeeze a really big brain inside a very unmalleable skull. And you see all sorts of tricks evolutionarily by which this happened. This is just a way of increasing efficiency of packing and decreasing the cost of wiring the whole thing up. So you begin to see clusters of function, localization of function, and then projections. Totally irritating term here. What this tends to be called by neuroanatomists is a nucleus. Oh Christ, we just went through cell biology stuff. A nucleus is found inside the cell, and there's the nucleus, and there's the DNA inside it, and it's the same term being used again. So be forewarned about the confusion when you have a cluster of neuronal cell bodies in the same place, and they have related function. You have a nucleus inside the brain. And we're soon going to learn the names of all sorts of different nuclei. So you have nucleus, and then you have projection cables made of axons, cell bodies, and this now begins to make sense with the next nucleus that's sending projection in two directions. All of that. One minor detail that sort of anchors this in our everyday sense of things. Axons are coated in these fatty insulation sheaths called myelin. And don't worry if you're not familiar with that or that was touched on in the catch-up sections. Myelin, because it tends to be fatty membranous insulation that makes conduction go faster, it tends to be fatty. Fat is white. The projections in the brain look whitish. The cell bodies look gray. And thus what you have when you look at a brain is you can divide it into areas of gray matter and white matter. And that's where that's coming from. Okay, so now beginning to make sense of this world of nuclei with their own distinctive functions and projections to various other places. When it comes to now understanding the neuroanatomy of the limbic system, there's all sorts of weird, screwy stuff that seems to be going on, which lines up making a lot of sense when you think things in the context of embryology, the brain developing. For example, you've got like this nucleus in the brain and that nucleus in the brain, and this one sends projections to this one, and like what's the most obvious thing on earth? This is what it should look like. And instead, what you see is it goes looping around all over the place, this ridiculous long projection, one of which we will look at in great detail. You say, what's the purpose of that? And what you see is at some point during brain development, embryologically, these two areas were this far apart. And you had to get a projection this far developing. And during embryogenesis, something folded in on something and looped over. And this one wound up being right next to this with this gigantic projection in between. It tells you something about embryology. Another example of that sort of bizarre business with this. Okay, so those of you who will wind up in medical school will know that the motor projections down the spine and the sensory projections up the spine decussate. Decussate, they switch sides, which is to say, here is a neuron, a motor neuron controlling a muscle in your left hemisphere, and when it gets to the spine, it switches sides and goes down the right side of your spine and goes and influences a muscle on your right side. And the right hemisphere has a decussation that switches sides here, and that's flipped over. This is like totally crazy. Why is that? It's clinically extremely important because if suddenly somebody's had some sort of neurological crisis and this arm, there's this arm, is suddenly paralyzed, you know that if that was due to a stroke, it was not due to a stroke on the same side, the arm, the same side. It was on the other side. That's where you go looking for some sort of stroke damage because the switch sides. Why should there be something this screwy as the side switching like that? And you will be so pummeled with learning at what level things decussate for different cranial nerves, and if there's like hemidecussation in some cases where it's not complete crossing. What's this about? All sorts of like speculation. Oh, there must be some adaptive reason for this. Ooh, echoes of 3 weeks ago. And what you see is it's actually a spandrel. During fetal development, there's this one point where the notochord, the thing that's destined to become the spine, something spatially happens and it rotates 180 degrees. And these projections get switched sides, and suddenly, like, we didn't evolve chins because they're good for something, and we didn't evolve decussating projections because, during embryology, something just rotates, and that's what you wind up with. So, what you then see also, great confusion, are circumstances where you look at how the wiring works, and it is the most like ridiculous, inefficient way of like solving a problem, and it winds up making sense in a certain context. Okay, so suppose you have 5 fingers, and here's your index finger drawn there, and you get it into your head that you want to bend your index finger. How do you do that? The logical thing is you would send a message. If it's on your right hand, it's coming from the left side of the brain, but you send out a message which tells this finger to bend. No, that's not what your nervous system does. What happens instead is descending from there are projections to all 5 of your fingers, telling all 5 of your fingers to bend. What? So how are you going to get independent movement of just this finger? And what you then see is superimposed on top of this excitatory circuit is a bunch of projections that go here and here and here and here and have inhibitory signal. And they're fast. What are you doing? You're sending a message to fingers 1, 3, 4, and 5 saying, hang on a second, you're about to get an excitatory signal. Don't pay any attention to it. And you block the response in 1, 3, 4, and 5, and then the result is you bend finger number 2. Could you get a more stupid, inefficient way of wiring up the whole system? This is ridiculous. Why is it wired this way? Because our distant ancestors, when they were like first developing into mammals or who knows what, because like you look at most species, animal species on Earth, and they don't play trills on the piano. They don't have independent finger movement. The basic thing is you extend your claws or you contract them or something. You normally, the primordial, the basic structure of the nervous system when it comes to digits is you send a message to all 5 of them to do something at once. And then when we got it into our primate heads to start evolving, playing trills on the piano and all of that, we had to come up with a way of only activating this finger. And you got a choice at that point. You can rip out the blue system there that's merely 100 million years old and start a big renovation project. And of course, it's going to run behind schedule and cost overruns. Or you could just say, you know what, we're not going to pull out the blue system. It's there, it's in there. Let's come up with a second system that will be superimposed on top. And what it will do is inhibit 1, 3, 4, and 5. And to which you say, that's ridiculous, that's so inefficient. But what you're seeing here is the evolutionary history. The blue stuff came first, and this is a more recent evolutionary invention. And what this gives rise to is this dictum we're going to like say over and over and over again from some famous French molecular biologist. I can never remember. It was this trio that got Nobel Prizes, Monod, Waff, and Jacob. I think it was Jacob. Evolution is not an inventor. Evolution is not an innovator. Evolution is a tinkerer. You got something in place and you're trying to develop something new, And you don't pull out, you just kind of say, okay, well, let's come up with this completely inefficient. Let's get a second layer superimposed on top, and let's get some duct tape and sort of put that in there. And you just kind of improvise stuff because evolution cannot de-evolve the blue system and then put in individual projections there. Evolution is just futzing around and doing the best it can with what's already there. And we're going to see fascinating examples of that principle when we come to discovering things like the part of your brain that evaluates whether somebody has done a morally disgusting act is the same part of the brain that's evaluating whether the piece of food you just tasted is disgusting and spoiled and toxic. Because the gustatory disgust part of your brain has been around for 100 million years, and every organism out there has to have some means of not eating something toxic. And the far more recent thing, I don't know, last 30,000 years or so, of morals and moral norm violations and moral disgust is much. You're not going to evolve a new part of the brain, Jacob. The brain is not an innovator in that sense. It just improvises, it just tinkers. And there was some committee meeting where they said, you know what, this part of the brain does gustatory disgust and olfactory disgust, moral disgust. I don't know, it kind of sounds like let's push it in there, jam it in. This part of the brain now does moral disgust. And we're eventually going to get to why this property of nervous system evolution is going to explain all sorts of cases where we have metaphors in our heads that feel as real as the real examples because you had to improvise evolutionarily, tinker to put this new metaphorical function into the part of the brain that did a literal version of it. So with these principles in place, as we're now beginning to turn to the limbic system, yes, this stuff is coming 2 days from now, so be prepared. But what we see on the far left here is two principles as to how to make sense of projections in the nervous system. And they're both built around the same idea. You are a neuron, or you are a cluster of neurons and nuclei, and what do you want more than anything on earth? You want to tell the rest of the brain what to do. You want to have maximal influence. And you can see this during brain development. And what's known is, okay, here's the axon hillock, that a synaptic connection here, an axonal projection here, is more influential over whether an action potential happens than a projection out here. There's a spatial feature to how influential different synaptic inputs are. And what you see is developmentally, during brain development, there's a competition. Different neurons compete not only to attach to this other end to form a connection, but to get the best places possible because that gives you the most influence. We see another version of this now that we're going to get to the systems level, which is so you want to influence that part of the brain, and you get this very, very simple rule, which is the more synapses between you and that part of the brain, the less influence you are going to have. And thus we've got these two brain regions. We've got these two brain regions, and they're both sending projections here. This one is one synapse away. This one is two synapses away. Which one is more powerful, more influential? This one, because for one thing, this one is slower, and this neuron has a mind of its own and may have a different opinion and alter it and all of that in playing telephone. You want to have influence by way of preferentially making synapses in the right places on neurons and having the most direct projections possible. And as we get to limbic neuroanatomy, we're going to see different parts of the limbic system that are very different numbers of synapses away from other parts, and that tells you something about who's most influential. So with that in place, what do you want to influence if you were the limbic system? Two things. There's two things you desire to do more than anything. You want to influence the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, again, if this is new stuff, go to catch up this week. The hypothalamus, which is regulating the rest of your body, hormones and the autonomic nervous system and all of that. So you, the limbic system, what you most want to do, you, any given structure in the limbic system, what you most want to do is to be able to tell the hypothalamus what to do. So an outflow, sufficiently so that one can think of the hypothalamus as both reptilian brain and limbic system, sort of an honoring member of both. This is the portal by which your emotions regulate, influence, control bodily responses to emotions. The other thing you want to do if you are in the limbic system more than anything else on earth is to tell the cortex what to do. And what we will be seeing is some projections that go into the part of the cortex, which on first pass seems like the most cerebral and affectless and rational and all of that. But it gets a gigantic projection coming up from the limbic system, a part of the frontal cortex, which is in fact kind of an honorary part of the limbic system, because that's where all the emotional information is coming in. And sometimes that helps you make some ridiculous, impulsive, stupid decision. Sometimes that helps you make an extremely empathic one. Sometimes we will see the limbic system, its desires are to control what the hypothalamus is running throughout the rest of the body and to control the sort of decision making that the cortex does. So with that in place, we are ready to now start looking at the subparts of the limbic system and who connects to who and how and what this tells us about function, which is where we will pick up on Wednesday.